Hi, everyone, and thanks again for having me. I do want to take a second. As a conference, an ex-conference organizer, I know how difficult it is to get all this stuff set up, especially virtually across so many time zones. So big shout out to the Into Design Systems team for getting all this set up and running it smoothly, despite little schedule blips and technology stuff and all that jazz. It's off to a great start. So as Kurt previously mentioned, my name's Taylor. I'm a multidisciplinary designer focusing currently on design systems based in North Carolina on the East Coast of the US. I currently work alongside a ton of really great people at a company called Hologram as their design systems lead, helping to evolve our current ecosystem into a true, more efficient design system to better serve our current and future product needs. I'm here today, though, on behalf of Team Handoff, a hackathon team that joined together back in January of this year to build a toolkit aimed at helping bridge the design to development gap. Here's the 3-minute backstory. In January of 2022, Sylvia and many other folks that are helping run this event today held a design systems themed hackathon where a bunch of aspiring and current systems practitioners gathered virtually from all over the world to collaborate and learn together. On the ideas board where project teams were forming, someone mentioned finding ways to improve the designer and engineer relationship in the context of building components. A small but mighty crew of designers and engineers gathered to discuss the topic. We very quickly realized that many of us were experiencing some of the same challenges. Mismatched design files from code and implementation, unclear requirements and documentation being handed from engineering to design and vice versa, gaps in communication when working across different teams to build components, depending on how your organization is set up. And the biggest one in some cases was misaligned styles due to many handoffs between different people or different teams or different groups or different library files, etc. Remembering that this was a hackathon and we both wanted to learn, but also have a shot at winning, we immediately got to work. The clear goal across many of our pain points and experience was to ease the intra-system communication and handoff, but specifically during the component design and build processes. And through a voting process capturing votes cast by the hackathon participants themselves, as well as the greater internet community, we won, which was really awesome. And since publishing our tool in March, we've had over 1,600 people duplicate and use our tool through Figma community. A tool that supports whichever model your organization happens to fall under. A tool built by practitioners for practitioners. And we're really proud of that. But I'd be doing my team a disservice if I didn't give them the actual spotlight, because I most certainly didn't build this on my own. This motley crew worked across 4 vastly different time zones in 3 8-hour shifts to ideate, scope, plan, and execute the MVP version of our concept. And then we spent about a month and a half refining the tool that's live today. So in order, it's Christian, Mariana, Marlene, Christoph, Sarah, and Agni from all over the world. And a little funny note, the 3 of us at the bottom all happen to live in North Carolina, which was just happenstance on that alignment. But what's more interesting than our time zone difference and the team itself is, and the win of the hackathon in general, is that through this project, we were really able to validate an assumption that we all sort of knew, but didn't really have any solid examples of. And that's that every single organization is different, no matter their size or team size or revenue or whatever, or product line. And there's no big surprise here, right? I mean, obviously every organization has a different approach to doing systems things, to doing product design, to doing engineering, sales, etc. Some, at least in the systems context, have a dedicated multidisciplinary team whose sole job is to support the design system. That's the dream, right? Like to have a funded, fully staffed group of professionals that can give a system the attention, effort, and time needed to do it right. But while that's becoming a growing model that many organizations are starting to lean on, it's far more common that there's a designer and engineer, sometimes separately, sometimes together, working on or maintaining a UI kit or does component library aside of desk work, meaning in addition to their normal workload. They don't have dedicated time. It's kind of 10 to 20% of what they're responsible for. Or that is just a small group of designers or engineers working on a shared library of components kind of for their discipline. And oftentimes they don't consult with the other discipline for sake of time or the way the company's departments and processes are organized. Sometimes those communication channels are just not part of the company's culture. Or that an organization uses a third-party library or a series of contractors and consultants to help design and or develop their library, oftentimes because they don't have the funding or appetite to support those functions internally. Whichever model your organization falls under, we know as current or future design systems practitioners that our libraries, design assets, documentation, and code are truly only as strong as our communication about those things are. And to be clear, there's two levels of communication that I'm talking about. Intra-system communication, meaning between the individuals working on or helping with the formation or maintenance of a system, like when the design for an object is done, or when a new token needs to be made, or when a piece of documentation has been approved, all the inter-team things, right? The other being inter-system communication, meaning between whoever's owning or working on the system and the folks who will effectively use those objects in their work, the consumers, right? Things like a new component is available for use, or a bug fix that's been released, or a version bump due to breaking change, right? Some of the stuff we've already heard about this morning or this afternoon for some of us. But today, I want to talk a bit about the intra-system communication, the communication, collaboration, and sometimes handoff between designers and engineers working to build, document, and ship elements of a system. Improving the communication between these two groups specifically leads to better components. And better components means a better system. And a better system means happier consumers and therefore better products. So that brings us to the problem statement. Handoff of specifications, tokens, spacing, states, etc., is often difficult and or lacking for components. Design files on their own don't provide enough information to successfully develop a component that we want to include in our design system. These spec files should include all the relevant properties and behaviors often prescribed by the designer, and then in a perfect world, a designer and engineer would discuss all the different aspects of a component, add additional notes, and then get to work together, right, on building that thing out. But many of us don't have access to full-time engineers or even have a fully staffed design systems team at our organization, which makes these handoff exercises and these specification documents even more important. The tools we have available, both from the design and engineering side, just don't do the job well on their own. While the tool we built is for and exists in Figma, it's not exclusively for designers. In other words, engineers should be filling in these gaps as well, and I'll explain how you can do that later on. Additionally, our tool can serve as a resource that engineers can give to the design teams to help them understand what they need to outline in order to make their vision of a component or a style or whatever come to life. At the end of the day, it's a communication tool to help have more focused conversations. So, to achieve this mission, we had to scope out a few considerations. We needed to be sure that anything we made wouldn't inherently prevent folks from using it. And we define these considerations as, number one, ensuring that what we made could be used across multiple experience levels. While design systems in general have been around for forever, formalizing them as like a business need and funding and getting a seat at the leadership table is relatively recent, like last 5 to 10 years. So making sure that folks new and old, so to speak, could use this tool was very important to us. We also wanted to make sure that using this tool didn't require extensive Figma or code framework knowledge, right? If there's a barrier to entry on making this thing difficult to use, then folks aren't going to use it, or they won't be able to, or it's going to take too much learning and research to do it. The next was that it's not dependent on any third-party tooling or plugins. Many of us having come from large enterprise organizations, right? I'm sure, and some of you probably here at large places as well, I'm sure you know how painful it is to get a new tool or a new product through the procurement process and get buy-in from leadership and try to do all these things and security checks and all that. So anything that was formalized or was a third-party, owned or some sort of formalized plugin sometimes can be a risk for larger organizations, preventing them from being able to use it. So we wanted to make sure that our tool did not hit any of those barriers. And lastly, and arguably most importantly, that it could evolve over time based on feedback that we received, or that it was easily clonable so that individuals like yourselves could fill in any gaps related to their particular requirements or organizations on your own, right, by cloning the file itself. And thus, the component spec tool was born. With this tool, we aim to help you, number one, annotate common CSS variables related to component development. That was one of the core goals that we were hoping to achieve. Another was to serve as a source of truth during the design and code processes, where often there's some tension, some misalignment, or forgotten details due to communication issues or different personalities or whatever. And lastly, to influence the process of both designers and engineers to encourage a documentation-first approach to building components and the inevitable handoffs that we all experience in different ways. So let's demo the tool in real life. I'm going to switch screen share real quick, and hopefully this will work seamlessly. Should still be seeing this window. Okay. So switch this, and then we're also going to switch cameras. we're going to do this all live, and we're going to hope it all works. Great. Can someone from the InDesign Systems team just confirm you're seeing the Figma page?
Yes, we are.
Awesome. Okay. So I'm not going to explain how to duplicate and find Figma community files, but this is a community page of our tool. You can see here that you access it through the community menu, and you can search, and I'll provide a link later, but just to kind of speed through this part, this is the cover page of the particular tool, right? So it gives a lot of information. There's a detail we provided here. There's links to the conference and the hackathon and details about it, and then all of our teammates, comment section, etc. But assuming that you've then cloned the tool, right? You hit the duplicate button, you're ready to rock. On first load, it'll come up like this. It's a very cover page looking document, but there's a handful of things we've included in here to help you kind of acclimate to the tool before getting started. So number one, we've included a pretty extensive README file, and the README has a few sections. So the first is how to enable the library and getting started. For those who may not be used to that, because in order for this tool to work correctly, you'll need to publish it as a library internally to your Figma instance. The second is a set of kind of an overview of the different boards and annotation features that are inside the file. And then the third is just some extra content and some Flexbox descriptions, for example, on helping orient designers who may not be used to the way to particularly spec space or alignment or arrangement of objects. But I'm not going to spend too much time here. I'm just going to jump into this section real quick just to give you kind of one little baby preview, and then I'll show you how it really works. So as I mentioned earlier, this tool works best when it's installed as a library. So this section will explain, here's how you publish that library internally. Here's how they can turn it off, and you can use it and move around. All the fonts and objects and stuff in here are by default, so there's nothing here that should be new. And what's nice about this tool as well is you can go in and change all the styles and colors of this thing and make it feel like it belongs to your company. That was kind of part of the point. So you can make it your own. But inside the other part of the quick start guide is just an explanation of the page structure and annotations and where you might find stuff in the library itself, right? So there's two parts to the tool. You can get a spec page, you can add components to that page, yada, yada, yada. So here's the real part, the fun part, right? So this is a demo file I put together using the tool itself. I'm going to show you 3 pre-built kind of spec'd objects, and one we'll kind of do together so you can see the power of the tool. So the first of which, so different organizations obviously are along a different maturity scale in their system, right? So in this particular example, this is a button component, and we also are under the assumption that there's a token library, the design tokens that are used. And I'll explain why that's significant in a second. But as you can see, this particular button is this little like blue guy with some white text and an icon. And by using the component spec tool, we can drag out little widget windows that can spec particular properties related to the button's visual display and or functionality. So you can see here we've spec icons, some shadow properties, padding properties, typography, and some things are, quote unquote tokenized. Now, mind you, these are just dummy content that we filled in, for example, like so shadow interactive default, right? Or white being the default fill color from your color palette. Obviously, you can do things like size and fonts and all that stuff and get tokens as well. This is obviously not a perfect example, but it's just kind of showing you that these boxes are very flexible. And alongside just doing, say, the button, is you can also go in and spec the states. We provided a handful of different boards where it's got some pre-filled construct that you can break or separate. But in this particular one, it's showing that there are a few states of this button, right? In this case, default, hover, active, focused, and disabled. And some properties change during each of those states. For this particular example, color, right? It gets a little darker on hover, a little lighter, lighter on hover, a little darker on active. On focus, there's a border property that happens. On disabled, the color goes transparent. And then because we're in Figma, we can also demo the different variants. Now, variants is a contentious word because it often means different things in different ecosystems, but for sake of just understanding that there are different compositions of the button, right? Icon left, icon right, label only, icon only, etc. This could be a potential way that you may demo that as either part of your documentation or during that handoff process that we were talking about a second ago. Now, another example, just to kind of round it out, right, is a switch, right? You can imagine, and you call this a toggle, a switch, whatever it is your system particularly decides to call it. But you can imagine there's also times where you haven't gotten to a point in your system where you're using tokens. You may just be using raw values still. So this is just another example of these little widget windows being able to accept, for example, a hex value. It's just a text box, right, where you can type in whatever you need to type in. And you can get as specific or as granular as you want, right, by having different properties enabled and disabled within these little widgets to explain and annotate different parts of your component whatever it is that your engineers maybe see or your designers want to call out in particular. So for example, right, in the focus state, as I mentioned earlier, just like the button, there's a border that appears only on focus. So we obviously don't have border properties on a component that doesn't have borders until it is a specific state. So you can see here, there's no border property spec until we get to the focus state, as an example. So one more example is using this inline alert, and I'm showing here that you can do space in the same way. So you saw already color, you saw typography, you saw padding in a small respect, and you saw border. So you can imagine too, well, hello, we have to spec space sometimes, right? And different paddings in different areas, right? So sometimes there's component padding, sometimes there's inner component padding, sometimes there's, you know, and I'm using padding as a term very loosely. Maybe you can use through margin or a myriad of other methods, but either way, you can imagine that like the padding around the icon or the space around the icon, say between the icon and the label, is a little bit different than the padding around the component itself, because you may be using a nested component to achieve, say, the background, right? So you can add things like padding around the label, right? So the label, assuming is part of the icon, right? There's an even 16 around the whole thing. But to the right of the icon, between the icon itself and the label, is only 8 pixels, right? So you need to be able to call those things out. Responsive size properties, right? There's a minimum height and minimum width, but in this particular case, the component may expand or grow depending on its use case. So we want to be able to say, you know, it's going to flex. There's no max, right? As an example. And you can do that for all sorts of different variations, right? And this is just showing the error version and the success version of this particular inline alert. So jumping right into an actual demo of how this tool can and should be used, right? So this is a toast component. It's just pulled from a library called Toastify. It's nothing special. The idea here is, like, you can imagine, like, we've got past the design phase, right? The designers have done their job. They've checked with the engineering to make sure things are functional. They've rooted out with the community to make sure this component is needed. It's part of their system, et cetera, et cetera. And they're at the point where they're like, okay, it's time to spec this particular component for handoff or for collaboration in order to actually engineer it, right? So again, assuming that you have the library turned on, you will then have access to the component spec tool. And inside of it are a set of animation tools, base components. These are just more for reference, and some spec pages, right? So we're going to start out by saying, okay, we know we're going to need to do a generalized anatomy page. So we're going to pull out a pre-built anatomy board, right? Now, mind you, again, all of this stuff is built to be detached. So if you want to change content, you want to add different windows to this, you absolutely can. So for this particular example, I'm just going to frame this object so it's got some structure, and I'm only going to spec the green variation of this toast, the success, right? So I'm going to add this to my window here, and I'm just going to rename this to toast spec. I'm going to come in here and adjust the component name to say toast. And we're not doing states yet. We're just doing an overall spec, so we can do that. And now we can already see there's some properties we're going to need to call out, right? There's a little bit of a drop shadow. There's a green border. There's different type hierarchy here with different kinds of textiles. There's an icon with color. You can see built with auto layout, there's a gap of space that's kind of prefixed between the edge of the content and the icon component that's nested inside of this toast. So I'm just going to pull out a few of these annotation tools to kind of show you how that works. I'm not going to go to the full extent, but as an example, right, we can drag out color, and let's say we're going to do, I don't know, typography. So these tools are created using variants. So for example, if we know we're going to put this particular box underneath, right? We want that arrow to be in the proper space, so we can put the arrow up, and then we can say, okay, we're going to spec the typography of this particular box. And then you can go in and say, you know, font style is regular, and the font weight, let's see, what is it? It is 14 and dim. So font weight is also regular, and the font size is 14 pixels. And again, if you have, let's say the font family was actually tokenized, right? You could say font family, and use whatever you know, prefix or whatever that you're there. These boxes will grow because they use auto layout to then have everything you need inside each of these spaces. Now there are some, we've overloaded these property panels with all of the typical CSS variables and things needed, but you may not need to show all of these things. There may not be a text transform or any sort of alignment properties in your particular toast. So you're more than welcome to go in and disable entire sections, right? Using the hide feature. So you can do that via the layer panel if you want, or you can do on Mac, I believe it's Command Shift H. Or if you, for example, know there isn't going to be a word break type, you can double click into that one in particular and hide that particular value, right? And the idea here, again, is that this is a communication tool, right? You're going to be filling in values. You're going to have your engineers help you fill in values. You're going to have opinions on design. You're going to have questions. But the idea, again, is you can just kind of mock these things up where you need to go. We know this is the green fill. There's no background color in this particular, or that icon may have background as part of the way it's engineered. But either way, you can adjust these things and change the labels as needed. So you can very quickly see the power of just being able to have some pre-filled objects that have a lot of the typical class names in CSS, or things we just need to think about as far as speccing particular objects. So I'll just pull out a few more so you can kind of see what comes pre-built, right? So margin's got all your margin direction, padding's got the same. We've got icon, particularly because sometimes icons are defined differently. We've got some transition delay for some animation things. We've got stuff around size. So there's a bunch of objects here that you can pre-fill, use, and manipulate in order to begin the specification of your components. So let me switch back to the other screen now. Please hold. Cool. So this tool is currently live today. And like I mentioned before, it's been duplicated by a ton of practitioners to date, and we couldn't be more proud. We have a bunch of ideas on how we might improve this thing and evolve it over time, including providing more comprehensive animation annotations. You saw that through that transition one was the only thing we really included thus far. Possibly building a component scraper automation that auto specs your components using this library, like maybe it pulls out things from the styles or from auto layout or whatever and fills in where you need to go. We've also been chatting a little bit with Beyond 6 and the Figma tokens team to find out if we can automatically annotate using known variables by creating an optional link between this tool and that particular plugin so that you can ingest the different styles and things needed to outline the different dimensions of your component. But rather than speculating, we'd also love to hear from you, our intended users. On that Figma community page I showed you earlier, there's a link to a survey and an email address where you can provide feedback directly to us, the core team working on this tool. Was there something particularly useful or hard to use? Is there a set of variables that you expected to see but didn't? Did you remix or enhance the tool yourself and want to share? Either way, we'd love to hear from you. So please check out that survey link after giving the tool a shot, and I hope you are able to give this tool a shot and stress test it to your needs and let us know how it's going. I want to say thank you again to the #1 Team Handoff for all the time and dedication and work we put into this tool. I'm very proud of it, and I'm very happy that we're able to get together and meet via the hackathon event. I also want to thank you all for your time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. That's all from me.